Hey folks, it's Michael with the Reason RX podcast. Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to talk about learning styles part 2 with Scott Harris again. We did part 1 of learning styles last time. So we looked at some learning assessments. So this time we're going to talk more about the theory, some science, some philosophy involved, and understanding what's going on in the learning process and in evaluating, assessing the learning style theory stuff on its own. And want to remind you, if you could share the podcast with other people you know, teachers, school administrators, school personnel, parents, students, help spread the word about rational education. It's very important for our children, for us, for the social environment we live in, and for understanding the world at large better, living in it, living better lives. And if you could donate to the podcast, help out, get maybe someone to market some more, get Melanie some headphones, some things like that. It'd help out a lot. So we'll get into talking to Scott, and hope you enjoy. So, hey, Scott.
Hello.
Okay, so to start out, let's kind of review some of the learning style stuff. Get the foundation set, some kind of definitions, and I'll put some links to some of this in the show notes. People can do their own research, look this stuff up. So here, on this blog, something about learning styles. I think they're quoting some definitions. I haven't looked it up to verify, so I'll take their word for it, and we can verify later. But Big Dog and Little Dogs, Performance Juxtaposition blog, I guess. So, learning styles and preferences. It says, a learning style is a student's consistent way of responding to and using stimuli in the context of learning. Keefe, 1979, defines learning styles as the composite of characteristic cognitive, affective, and physiological factors that serve as relative stable indicators of how a learner perceives, interacts with, and responds to the learning environment. So I'll read it again. And he got it right. He said relatively stable. I accidentally said relative. So he got his adverb correct. So a learning style is a composite of characteristic cognitive, affective, and physiological factors that serve as relatively stable indicators of how a learner perceives, interacts with, and responds to the learning environment. Okay, and then he says Stewart and Felicity, I guess, in 1992, defined learning styles as those educational conditions under which a student is most likely to learn. So, of course, in the first one in Keefe, it's a stable indicator. Stewart and Felicity, it's most likely to learn. In this one over here, learning styles. The term learning styles, this is Vanderbilt, Center for Teaching. Vanderbilt University, Center for Teaching. The term learning styles is widely used to describe how learners gather, sift through, interpret, organize, come to conclusions about, and store information for further use. Again, it's widely used to describe how learners gather, sift through, interpret, organize, come to conclusions about, and store information for further use. As spelled out in VARC, one of the most popular learning style inventories, these styles are often characterized by sensory approaches: visual, oral, verbal, reading, writing, and kinesthetic. Many of the models that don't resemble the VARC sensory focus are reminiscent of Felder and Silverman's Index of Learning Styles, with a continuum of descriptors of learners for how learners process and organize information. And they have active versus reflexive, sensing versus intuitive, verbal versus visual, sequential versus global. And they say there are well over 70 different learning style schemes. And the reference for that is Cofield 2004. And most of the schemes are supported by a thriving industry devoted to publishing learning style tests and guidebooks, and professional development workshops for teachers and educators. And some of that's quoted from Patchler, 2009. And then they do have on this page, they have a caution. Why are they so popular? We can get into it later. But then on another one, teach, make a difference. Learning style speaks to the understanding that every student learns differently. Technically, an individual's learning style refers to the preferential way in which the student absorbs, processes, comprehends, and retains information. And they talk about VARC. And in, I guess I don't have the great Wikipedia open up right now for their definition, but we get the idea. I think I read the Wikipedia thing last time. So that's the idea that we're discussing here. So notice it's defined by some different people in different ways. So what do you think about that, those definitions and all that, Scott?
So before we start dissecting definitions in some of the studies, let's pull back a little bit and look at how all of this started. One of the years here, 1979 or something like that. So a lot of the early studies were the 70s through the 90s, and that's when the industry kind of took off. The stream that was going on in the 70s through the 90s was to try and kids that weren't the traditional grade students, that schools tend to serve them pretty well. And what about the rest of the kids? Special ed gets good treatment typically, and then how do we reach those kids that are kind of in the middle? And so in addition to learning styles, you had a lot of things coming out. The Myers-Briggs, which is based on human psychology, this idea that there's different types of people, and thus we need to identify the types, and then we can better engage, right, and differentiate for those kids. Also in the 90s, you had Howard Gardner with his theory of multiple intelligences, that intelligence or IQ was not a fixed thing that you either had or you didn't, and that schools typically looked at students that were strong in math and verbal and could behave well, and we call those good students. But what about the artist? What about the kid who is a little bit different, and so on? Now, Gardner is quick to point out that his theory of multiple intelligence is not the same as learning styles. Because some people have knocked his theory thinking it's learning styles, so there are some differences. But again, you see it's this idea that there's different types of people and different types of learners, and if we just find the right way to engage, then we're going to unlock some pretty significant gains for that kid.
Yeah, and so we see right here, we're already getting into necessarily some of the scientific and philosophical aspects. And so that's one thing that's important. It shows that we can't talk about this without talking about some philosophy. It's implicit. So some scientists who think they can do science philosophy free don't know what the hell they're talking about. It's like a big thing in physics. And I think some of that came about. I was listening to a good series of lectures, still working on it. The Great Ideas of Philosophy. Book details by Daniel Robinson. It's in the Great Courses thing. This is the Great Ideas of Philosophy, second edition. And he brought up in there that the illogical, unfortunate antipathy between a lot of physicists and philosophers came about around Hegel's time. Because, of course, people know history, philosophy is the love of knowledge, and everything was all wrapped up into one. Physics, philosophy, history, just knowledge in general. Then the separate sciences started to be developed and they could be studied more on their own because so much was going on in them. You could just spend a lot of time just studying one thing. But I forget some of the details, but because of some of what Hegel and some people were doing at that time, this antipathy developed. So it hasn't always been. It's just some unfortunate, illogical thing from that time that is carried on. But as we talked about in a previous podcast, you have to have philosophy. And, of course, some people realize that, like on that Big Biology podcast, the quote from a quote from a Big Biology podcast episode I talked about. Maybe I'll put it in the show notes. But someone said that like there was some people debating, 2 philosophers and 2 scientists, and then Richard Dawkins said something like, "Well, I don't need philosophy. I'm a scientist. I'm only concerned with the truth." And then this guy on the podcast says, and then a Frenchman in the audience yelled, "What is truth?" So, of course, the point is, it's funny for someone who knows what's going on because what is truth is a philosophic question. That's like the point of the joke or the anecdote. You can't do science, as we've talked about before, without knowing about some logic, what is truth, what your subject is. In other words, you got to know philosophy. You can't distinguish one science from another without having a philosophic perspective. You got to be kind of conceptually outside that. So philosophy is very important. You can't do without it. When people try to do without it, they're still implicitly going on it, whether they like it or not. But a lot of this is, some of these ideas are very wrapped up in a certain philosophy, so you can't just look at learning styles and think about everyone's talking about the same thing, or the theory in general versus people who aren't. You got to look at what is their philosophy, what are their premises, what do they mean, what is learning, what is a human being. You cannot separate these questions about learning, like you cannot talk about learning styles apart from those questions and answers to them. And I think, go ahead.
Well, that's an interesting point. That are there really different types of people? This is a metaphysical question, right. An epistemological question. Getting back to how do we learn? What are the methods by which we learn? And that's where cognitive psychologists come in. Now, some have done those studies, as I mentioned, the 70s through the 90s. But what we've done since the 90s is had a chance to evaluate and do meta-analyses of those studies, and do they show cognitive gains? If this theory was working so well, because we've been pushing it in schools for a couple of decades now, and I saw a survey the other day that 97% of public school teachers believe in learning styles. Well, what are the big gains? If this idea works so well, how come we haven't gotten this leap forward that we were promised?
Yeah, that's one thing you got to do scientifically to evaluate it. Besides which, like one thing some people should be doing is like philosophic analyses. Is it philosophically valid? Do some studies like that. But to get back to some of this, I think some, from what I've seen, and it makes sense to me, knowing some history and history of philosophy, I think some of this stuff came about from around the time of the behaviorists too, pre-1970. And so we got, to really get this, you got to look at Dewey and Skinner and people like that and see what they were doing. So with B.F. Skinner, he was very popular at the time. Unfortunately, kind of like in Chicago in the musical, when they're talking about lawyers or something, you gotta dazzle them, razzle dazzle them. Like, in other words, it's all like show. There's no substance. But Skinner believed in behaviorism, and so there was this focus, instead of, okay, so we got Dewey claiming that Aristotle has worked so long, he's got to be wrong now. Everything's like in flux. Everything always changes. Skinner is, with his behaviorism, says we focus, on certain behaviors because you can't study consciousness. So there's all this great information that was used about logic, reason, how learning should be done, thousands of years, but because of Dewey and Skinner, a lot of it was thrown out. And so instead, we got this concrete bound focus on seeing stuff or reading stuff or hearing stuff or chanting songs. And so that's some of the history of it too. It's that's why it's important to know history, and clearly the philosophy is important. It's a cause of what's going on today. You can't really get it with an understanding without seeing those causes. Scott?
Yeah, B.F. Skinner grew out of John Watson's theory of behaviorism, in which we would look at external behavior and ignore the interior. And this was a step forward for psychology because it was making it more empirical. Why does the rat run the maze? Who knows? Let's time it and let's reward it and see what happens. Well, Skinner then really lays out the principles of behaviorism, and he's been listed as the most influential psychologist ever.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, and he gave us the tools we've all heard of: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment. And so positive and negative reinforcement increase behavior, punishment decreases it. And so he laid out schedules of reinforcement and methods by which these things could be used effectively. But you can find videos of him on YouTube. He was incredibly confident. He was just very certain that he had solved the human problem and thought we could eliminate criminality, right, any kind of deviance through enough manipulation of these three tools. He also thought there was no such thing as free will, so he really extinguished. And philosophers argue about that today, but there was no telling Skinner that he hadn't solved it all. But again, let me ask, where are the big gains? Because he laid those theories out in the 70s, and it was predicted to revolutionize schooling, and SATs have flatlined since the 70s.
And I think he tried to do some of that, because since it's just rewards matter, they throw out consciousness. And I think, unfortunately, that's a mistake some people made, like throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I think he, I guess from what you're saying, I haven't studied that aspect, but it could be good that he introduced some empirical methods into psychology. But the problem is, throwing out consciousness destroys everything and undercuts everything. They really need that. It should have been the empirical methods with consciousness, not without.
Well, and so the humanistic school grew out of a criticism of Skinner, along with the cognitive school of thought, looking at how does our brain work, how do we become better humans, because they felt that between Skinner and Freud, those methods really dehumanized people. And if you look at the psychology section in a bookstore today, typically it's labeled self-help, which is just a horrible label.
Yeah.
But it ought to be called the humanistic school, because that's really what it's looking at.
Yeah.
So I think Skinner's tools are useful, but they're only a tool, and they're not useful for everything.
Yeah, and they are not all tools that psychologists should have in their toolbox. And I think, from what I've read, what I remember, because of his focus on behavior, I think he was thinking machine learning would be the future.
Yes.
And I think he tried to do that with his daughter, and I think it gave her psychological problems or didn't work very well or something like that. I don't remember the exact details. Have you heard that? Are you familiar with that from?
Yeah, it's been a while since I read about that, but yeah, he built a special crib for his daughter that had. I don't recall what mental health issues she had, and if she did, and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
those can be certainly more complex than.
And then another mistake he made was that's still with us today is thinking that animals don't feel pain, and that goes back further. I think some of the Stoics might have believed something like that. I heard that in a book, but I'm not sure if they understood what the Stoics were saying exactly. But anyway, Skinner and Descartes, they believed that animals were not conscious, and so they didn't really feel pain. It's this mistaken idea that if you got to be conscious of your pain, so you got to be like an observer looking at your pain, and then it's real pain. But if you just feel it, well, that's not real pain. So Skinner caused that's influence in our culture that's horrible. Still with us today, and some people, or because of those ideas from Descartes and Skinner, a lot of babies were thought not to feel pain either because they couldn't introspect. If you couldn't grasp or put into words like that you were in pain, then they believed you didn't really feel pain. It was just, the thing was just moving like a machine. It's like totally ludicrous.
Well, I think another thing driving this movement is that education is repeatedly infected by moral panics that,
Mm-hmm.
It's the Japanese or the Koreans or the Finnish high schools or whatever going to get ahead of us and so on. And these discoveries that we've been doing it wrong all along. And if we just adopt learning styles or engage the right hemisphere of the brain more, then we're going to unlock that hidden human potential. And I think that plays to the human tendency to want to find a trick or a gimmick or an easy way to learn and to master things, and there isn't one.
Mm-hmm.
Learning is hard, and it takes effort. How many trends and fads have we been through in education, all of which were going to revolutionize, right? iPads in the classroom, and kids would just love learning, and now nobody uses iPads much.
Yeah, so, and they're related. It's interesting. I think what you say about the gimmicks and the kind of moral panic thing is part of an aspect of human nature going back millennia. And then another aspect of what's going on is you got some of that panic and looking at concrete individual things because the abstract theory has been taken away. It's been destroyed by Dewey and Immanuel Kant and some others. The proper perspective, Kant was theoretical, so you can't say that he didn't believe in theory because he did, and to some extent Dewey. But they're saying that Aristotle's wrong. Logic doesn't matter. They have false views of reason, and so people give up on this stuff. And then, since they don't have the broad perspective, then you got the moral panic. Oh, use an iPhone. Oh, use an iPad. Oh, learning styles. Oh, this. Oh, that. Instead of if they had the proper perspective and knew philosophy better and what was going on, it'd be like, okay, wait. What is the essence of education? Learning is an effect. So what's the cause-effect sequence or sequences we need to go through to produce learning? We should study it like a scientist, is like Maria Montessori, or some Montessorians said, every teacher should be like a scientist. We need to do some of that to see how to cause good learning and concepts and logic in students, how to train them.
Well, one of the quotes I have on my wall is by Francois Rabelais from the 17th century. Why did the old folly end now and no later? Why did the modern wisdom begin now and no sooner? And that is kind of a rudder for me because, again, when these new ideas come along, that all of a sudden everybody believes in it, and we better do it now or we're going to lose out somehow. That makes me very skeptical.
Mm-hmm.
So to the point you just made, one of the things we know is that prior knowledge is really important.
Yeah.
And if a teacher can engage a kid's prior knowledge, it helps build semantic networks, etc. Well, there's something called the expertise reversal effect, that learners with low prior knowledge learn more from studying examples than they do from solving the equivalent problems. But this pattern reverses for learners with higher prior knowledge. Now, imagine a teacher, instead of being aware of that and providing those two different approaches for their kids, is instead trying to funnel things into a visual style or an auditory style. They may still get some learning, but they're really spinning their wheels compared to what they could be getting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's too much taking the regurgitate and forget for granted, focusing too much on words. If people would think about concepts and ideas and the conscious aspects that are not as widespread in our culture or deeply known as they should be because of B.F. Skinner and people like that, if they would focus on the concepts instead of just the words in deeper learning, everyone would be much better off. They'd be better teachers, students would be better prepared, they'd learn more, there'd be understanding instead of just regurgitating and forgetting. But yeah, so the history of this and the philosophy, it's important putting in context the learning styles and why people are talking about this so much, looking at, and even going back to like Plato and Immanuel Kant, but I think if we see kind of what John Dewey said and a little bit about B.F. Skinner, people can start reading up on those two on their own, and then it'll make sense to them why that we're doing the learning styles. And then if you look at a book like The Art of Reasoning by David Kelly, going into something that's the same for all human beings, it's like much more effective. So people are concerned about all these differences, and do any of them ever stop and think how we're all the same, or what's the essential human nature that from which these differences arise or in which they're embedded?
Well, that's a good point. As far as how our brains work, we have a lot more in common, a lot more than we do different. So there's more to be gained by studying the common cognitive architecture of how our brains work than there is on how they're a little bit different. But again, school is obsessed with differentiation, that we've got to, tailor fit. Some schools even force teachers to have an IEP, an individualized education plan for each student. And then somehow you're supposed to make all your lessons for 200 plus kids. But if we're ignoring those common things, for instance, blocked practice versus random practice. So in something as simple as handwriting, if we're teaching kids to make, say, a cursive W, people think that we should have them practice W's, right? A whole page of W's, uppercase and lowercase. But it turns out that having kids practice a W, an X, a V, a T, a P actually gets faster and better results.
Yeah, even though it doesn't seem that way at first, in the long run. And it could cause some frustration and make some students think they're not really learning. And that comes up in the book Range, some of that also that I talked about before. Yeah.
And that's what they call desirable difficulty. It is a little bit irritating. It is a little bit frustrating. That means you're learning.
Right.
If it's smooth and easy, you're doing something you already know how to do. So
true.
What made me think of this was you said about memorizing and regurgitating, and that's surely what a lot of high school and multiple choice tests are. But if we look at blocked practice, and this is a study by Rohr and Taylor, 2007. So kids were learning unrelated formulas, blocked practice, immediately correct 89%. But 1 week later, they got only 20% correct. Whereas when they did mixed practice, Immediately they got 60% correct, but a week later they got 63% correct. That's 3 times as good a results. And so in a course like mine, where they take the advanced placement exam at the end of the year and they can get college credit if they do well enough, studying the correct way, your grade might be a little bit lower as we go through the course, but then you do a whole lot better at the end versus getting a higher grade because you're memorizing and regurgitating, and then you go to the AP exam and you get crushed.
Yeah. And if people want to look into that a little bit, there's a podcast called the Learning Scientist Podcast, and they're discussing some of that. And again, like, they're scientists, they're good people, but they're like Scott and I were before we learned some philosophy. It's not like we're special people like Superman. We're human beings like everyone else. But these Learning Scientist podcasts, these people in the Learning Scientist podcast, they would be doing better stuff if they knew more philosophy. So they're still doing some like kind of concrete bound stuff like this learning styles thing. Kind of not their fault. It's just the culture we live in. But looking at some of what they do would be, and listening to them, it's like interesting podcasts and some good information to use, even though they're not talking about logic, concept formation, induction, some things like that. And like, they're more like, it's the E.O. Wilson quote. Few scientists are philosophers. Many are intellectual journeymen. I forget what else he said, like exploring locally, hoping for a strike, stuff like that.
If I'll point out that they are aware of the absence of good evidence on learning styles, and they really do focus more on how to study. Yeah, which we maybe need to do a podcast episode on that.
Cool. Yeah, good idea.
A lot of students spend a lot of time studying with some of the least effective methods.
And one thing I want to bring in too, before I forget, make some tie-ins. So with the IEP EP thing, one thing that reminds me of, it's interesting. I think it was the Greek. Let's see. There's Bauer's The Greek Experience, and then what's her name who wrote about Greek mythology in the Greek way? Edith Hamilton. Yeah. So Edith Hamilton, I think in her The Greek Way, or Bauer in The Greek Experience, I forget, one of them, they talked about how in ancient Greece, the focus was on being your kind, being human. And so to be like a heroic character, you had to be the best human you could be. But nowadays, the focus is on being different. It's like not paying attention to your essential nature, not looking at what and who you are generally. And they pointed out how that comes up in architecture, in literature, and some things like that. Very cultural, philosophical phenomenon. And so we got people getting all worked up about Dennis Rodman because he had like different color hair. Woohoo! Like, he like yells and screams and has different color hair and acts like a little kid. And so, oh, he's so great. But I think some of that general perspective is part of the thing driving the IEP. Like, how are they different from everything else in the universe? And that's versus how are they human? It should be, how are they being very human and like the general case? You got to look at everyone's individual. As Aristotle pointed out, the individual is primary. We need to look at what we are, though, if we're going to do education and things in general right.
And there is enough variance within humanity that by developing yourself as a human, as the humanistic school argues, we're still going to get tremendous diversity. It's not like it's going to make everybody the same because we have different genetics, we have different experiences, different upbringings.
Mm-hmm. Emotions. Epigenetics. Epigenetics is very important. Like some people say, people before, maybe in the 50s or something, some people just without, I think, without thinking through things fully, thought some things like cancer were pretty much genetic, 90%, 100%. But, and listening to some things nowadays, and maybe even some of this, I think, might even been on the Big Biology podcast again. I forget, but now, you talk to a biologist who knows what he's talking about, cancer researcher, and they say, genetics is like 1% or less of cancer. Everything else is epigenetic. But very important thing in our health and attitude. Just like we had on specialist in, I'm kind of tired now, so I'm blanking out on the name, but specialist in motor development. She was talking.
EJ?
Pardon?
EJ?
No, we had on a podcast. Like we interviewed someone.
Yes.
Yeah. We didn't interview Piaget. That'd be nice.
That'd be pretty good.
But she was talking about how at birth, if you don't have this breathing reflex occur, that can affect you through your whole entire life. And so someone can fall into anxiety easily when they're an adult, and people can make mistakes about their character, but it's all because they just got to fix this like breathing reflex thing. It's neurodevelopment. Very interesting. But and one other point I want to make, so we talked about the IEP, and let's just focus on differences, ignoring the similarities and the essence of a person as a human being. One thing I think comes up, one thing that, as you talked about, there's this drive to differentiate, and it's part of the social thing, and it's in human nature. And if people look at, there's some evidence for that is the fact that, evolution's true. So we should look at other animals, look at our evolutionary history. We'll learn more about us because we're animals. But some people were studying, and I've talked about this before, some people were studying some chimpanzees. This female chimpanzee, for some reason, put a piece of straw in her ear. Then all these other chimpanzees started doing the same thing. They were just walking around with a piece of straw in their ear. It's just a fad. So that's what I call a lot of human fads too. Like when people do something like learning styles, it's just like a piece of straw in people's ear. Or when they're talking about some like TV star like the Kardashians or something, just a piece of straw in people's ear. Just a meaningless little thing that people are doing because someone else is doing it. But, so, I think, that's evidence that some of that's deep in our nature. And you've pointed out some of that before too, Scott, in prior podcasts about some things some people do to belong. Sometimes to show that you belong to a group and you're very committed to them, the more absurd the thing is, the more commitment you show to the group.
Well, and that's interesting.
And I'm not, wait, I'm not saying learning styles is necessarily absurd. It seems like it's plausible, and if people think it seems like there's evidence for it. I'm not saying it's totally absurd, but it's wrong. But it's more plausible than something like that. So go ahead. I just wanted to be clear that I'm not calling some people stupid and absurd. Okay.
That's another point with any trend that comes along in education is that the early adopters, right, are seen as avant-garde of we're bringing the new idea and we're going to get the gains. And, of course, administrations often like this, and especially if they've picked the idea, right, we read books over the summer and found this new thing that's going to give us big gains. And then you get some division between people who are skeptical because you're not on board with helping the youth and so on.
Oh, yeah.
Get a little bit of contention between groups. But that's the benefit of empirical research is that, let's actually sit out and measure these methods against each other and see if we can get gains.
Yeah, because it's good to be social and get along, but we got to be real. If we're being social without being real, it is not good for us. It is not good for the children. It's a waste of money. It's a waste of time, and it can be destructive. We need to be empirical and real. But yeah, and then now that you mentioned that, reminds me, it's probably another thing that gets some of this going. Just the human drive and the fact that it's like in our nature to value the novel. A lot of animals do that. It's another thing we find evolutionarily in zoology. Like male deer rub their antlers on trees. They want to scrape off the that layer that's on it and get it down to just the antler, like the bone. But they don't just go find any tree. They need a tree that's like a certain width and some things like that. But I don't remember if it's like most of the time or all the time, they find a tree that's different than others. Like I know in my area, there's a magnolia that's dead now because deer were using it to rub their antlers. And it's like, there's not a lot of magnolia out there in the wild around here. And it's like, stands apart from the others. And that's the one they go to, the one that's novel. And I think, it's like a human thing too. But it's deep in our nature.
Our brain very much likes novelty and change. We get little hits of dopamine, the neurotransmitter.
Yeah.
When we have novelty and change.
It's important to be aware of that so we don't get razzle-dazzled by it, get misled. But, so anything else you want to say, like on the history of philosophy of this so far?
Well, if you think of all of us as individuals being a Venn diagram, as I said before, there's a lot more similar. So we're really overlapping as far as how our brains work. And then our differences are these little fringe edges where we vary. And to me, to spend all this time trying to get into those little fringe edges is, first of all, presuming that we have maximized what's overlapping. And that's where the interesting cognitive research is that we really haven't been teaching kids how to study and how to learn according to what cognitive psychologists say how our brain works.
Or good philosophy, for that matter.
Right. But even before we inject a good philosophy, if we have bad methods and bad philosophy, it's amazing we've gotten anywhere.
Yeah.
But the highlighting and the rereading of notes, these are among the least effective tools out there, and it's what kids are being taught.
Mm-hmm. But we see where some of this learning style idea comes from, why it's so popular today, and why we have a focus on learning styles as opposed to thinking styles or styles of cognition or like logical MOs, logical method of operation. No one talks about that. It's all learning styles. Or even, I don't know, when people talk about metacognition, I doubt they even talk much about logic, induction, concept formation, deduction, reduction, which examples are you using, things like that. It's more superficial like this. Might even be affected by some people's growing up in the culture and just the implicit focus on like behavior or concrete things instead of more abstract essential things. So, like some people are too bound up on how this rock falls versus how that rock falls. Oh, look, how fast does this one turn? Oh, look, this one's turning the other way. Like, they're so different. Oh my gosh, and there's a ball versus a rock, instead of thinking, whoa, they're all masses being pulled to the ground, and F equals MA, and F equals M time, or G time, capital G times M1, M2 over R squared, and things like that. We're not measuring how things fall in general. It's all, oh, look, like a leaf fell under this one and it was so different. So we got to look more at the essence of it, think more abstractly like that, like F equals ma instead of just this particular rock. Instead of getting carried away in some of this concrete detail. And the thing should be to look at both, not one or the other. You shouldn't look at abstractions divorced from concretes or concretes divorced from abstractions. It should be, we're human beings, we unify them both. And that right there is a mistake some people make in some like cognitive theories. There's like the abstract versus the concrete. Excuse me, we're learning. How the hell can you have one without the other? You cannot. And that comes from a bad philosophy, thinking that you can have the abstract without the concrete. And if people want to think about it, just think about where does the word abstract come from? It means pulled away from. You can't pull out some general idea unless you have some things from which you pull it out. It's not like an abstract idea without concretes. That's a contradiction in terms if you really understand what abstract means. But that's what some people get into with some of their like learning style stuff. Wikipedia talks about that. If people want to look at different theories of learning style, different tests, just like last time we did some tests like the VARC and some others, and saw that they were pretty similarly messy. But that's one issue maybe we can bring up a little now, that that the measurement tools people have or the means of classification are worthless. So we got this learning style stuff. Okay, maybe the theory is all like cute and nice, like some little fairy tale, but how the hell do you put a person in it? The means are just invalid. As we talked about before, you can't differentiate by these instruments.
And one of the dangers of that is kids then buying into the idea, and that I can only really learn, or I can only learn best if it's presented this way. Life isn't going to custom fit everything for you.
Yeah. Agreed. And then we're looking at reality and taking that philosophic perspective. You got to look at the fact that, for one thing, look at some people like 10,000 years ago. What did all the people who were like had a reading style, did they like die off? Well, then why are they nowadays? Like, were their genes lost? No. 10,000 years ago or more, there was no reading learning style because reading didn't exist. And you had to do everything. You're out looking at stuff like you're hunting or gathering. You had to move. You had to be kinesthetic. You had to pay attention to what's going on. You had to be visual. You had to pay attention to odors in the environment, how things tasted and smelled. There was no choice. You lived in small bands, and there wasn't like, so in my reading, I've learned that maybe someone would be like the medicine guy and someone would like make arrows and stuff, but I've never read anything that said like this person in the tribe was like the visual person, this person was the auditory person, and this was a kinesthetic person. No, you were it all. You were the whole package. That's what a human being is. And so, yeah, so like you got these people, these kids at a young age, they're taught that they're this one kind of learner, and then that ruins their whole life. They don't know what it is to be a human being, to develop all these things. They miss out on some skills. Besides, we got to be ready for reality. Reality doesn't adapt to us. We got to be ready for everything. And one thing learning styles does, as you say, with the kids and the teachers, is not prepare them to deal with the reality and make them focus on that one thing. If you're going to learn learning style, you use for learning styles for anything, it should be, okay, you're strong in this, so therefore we're working on everything else because you need that for life. You've got to be able to learn by what you see. You've got to be able to learn by what you hear. You got to be able to learn by reading and talking to people. You got to be able to learn by moving. So you like reading, do it on your own. We're moving, looking, and listening because that's what you need as an adult to be effective in life. if anything, that's how it should be used.
Agreed.
You got to look at preparing someone for life, not pandering to their wants. And then, right there, we can get into another aspect of like philosophically. Okay, what do you mean by learning? I think a lot of these studies, they mean learning academically, and they're just doing it in terms of behavior and maybe how someone performs on a test, and not looking at, since consciousness is out, they're not looking so much as how the person really understands, how they know what's going on in their minds, their ability to live and thrive in the world. It's all just on this like multiple choice test that this is done, and I don't think that's real learning. Knowledge is knowledge about the world, not just memorizing some words socially and being able to regurgitate and forget. It's not just mere social behavior. So some of that seems just equivalent to someone knowing what style of clothes to wear at the time. So maybe the style is appropriate for that culture, but what if you go to a different place? How are you going to dress? What about when it's cold? What about when it's hot? Dress for the real world, not for the culture. Learn for the real world, not just for the culture. Not to dismiss the culture. People are important. Culture's important. We're social animals, but we all need to be individually capable of knowing and living in the real world. But so I think, it's a big mistake that was made. But and then things like tennis, riding a bicycle. Do you think anybody could read about how to ride a bicycle and then just get on wood and all of a sudden like win the Tour de France? Or is riding a bicycle essentially kinesthetic, regardless of what we want it to be or what our learning style is? Or has anybody ever been on record of reading about playing tennis and then winning Wimbledon in their first match?
Well, and it just seems an unnecessary division that if you're explaining to ride a bike, you can read about it, but you're going to see it and you're going to hear it. Those are working in conjunction with each other.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm. When we go down the path of learning styles, we're separating them away from each other, which seems unnecessary.
Yeah. And besides that, it is a misrepresentation of the real world. As you say, all these things are intertwined and they're all used to learn something. Just like I forgot, it's been a while, but I think that might have been what Aristotle, isn't that what he said about like the common sense? It's where all the senses came together and everything was organized. Nowadays you got the term common sense, but I think Aristotle knew that you had these different sense organs, but they were all experienced as if they're one, which is how we do it. It's all like knowledge of one reality. And then that reminds me too, that's like one place where I think some people make some mistakes. So yes, we have eyes and we can see, we have ears, we can hear, we have a mouth, we can talk, we move. And so then people draw the errant conclusion, though, that we have learning styles, but it's kind of confusing our metaphysical nature and the fact that we have these organs with an actual style of learning. I think there's some mistakes going on there, but that's one thing that can make some people buy into it. Oh yeah, I like to look at things, so I'm a visual learner. No, you just like to use your eyes and look at things. Just part of our nature. Then it ignores the fact that they're all integrated. And that's one thing that we got to do. You got to utilize and integrate all sources of information not try to ignore all of them except one. You can't survive in the world like that. Like you're riding a bicycle and you got both visual and kinesthetic information involved. You got to pay attention to balance. You got to look where you're going. It's got to be all unified and integrated into one experience to do that well. And I think that's one thing that some of these people point out, at least, that, and I'm sure you've read too, Scott, that some, people who look into this say that it's the content that should be the primary driver of method, and then any learning style stuff is secondary or tertiary. You got to get the mode of presentation appropriate for the content first. That's what's important.
Yes.
Just like you want to learn to ride a bicycle, well, then you ride a bicycle. You want to learn to play tennis, well, then you play tennis and you practice playing tennis. And that's the essential thing. And feeding into that can be watching, reading, watching pros, listening to what your instructor says. But it's all based in the playing. Just like reading is based in the reading. You got to read to read. And then, as we've said before a little bit, yeah, it's like people should really question of what they mean by learning, and look into a little bit of logic. Look at The Art of Reasoning by David Kelly. Think about how you really learn in the world. Think about how animals learn, how ancient man learned. We didn't get here out of nowhere. We didn't get here from people who were stupid. We got here from people who were just like us and who set the stage for us and just didn't have all the knowledge yet, but they were just as rational. And there were people, thousands of years ago who were some individuals who were more rational and logical and honest and genius than some people nowadays. At least insofar as they could be. It'd be hard to say exactly, but you got to think about what they did. Any other words, Scott? I know it's getting late. We're both getting tired. You're yawning. I'm getting more and more brain dead.
My son had a sleepover last night. So
Whoa. I'm surprised you're already not in bed. Wow. But, yeah, so, sorry we didn't get maybe in so much of the theory of learning styles itself, but I think it's an important discussion. We got to get out there about the philosophic foundation of it, where it comes from in history and the history of philosophy, the learning styles idea, why it's so prevalent, why people believe it, and kind of like how to really think about the issue, why it's not true, what's really true. So those things we talked about, the history of it, like some Dewey and Skinner and Gardner. And then I'm so tired I even forgot what I just said. We also looked at why people believe it, like the chimpanzee thing, the fact that we like novelty, the fact that we're social animals, things like that. That's some reasons why it's prevalent. The fact that there are differences and people are trying to explain it. The fact that we have different sense modalities and then people are trying to tack on extra theory to that. Then why is it not true? Well, because we get all what are you going to say, Scott?
Because the empirical evidence doesn't support it.
Right. It's not real. It might be a social fad, but it's not real. And it doesn't take into account, you can tell by its philosophic history that it's wrong and illogical. We got to look at consciousness and what people are like in their essence to study this scientifically. Like, what's the essence of a mass? What's the essence of a carbohydrate? What's the essence of a protein? Things like that. What's the essence of a cat? What's the essence of a dog? What's the essence of a person, and how do they learn? What is reasoning? What is logic? What is learning? What is human learning? You got learning in general and thinking in general. Animals can think, but they don't think rationally. Only humans have rational thinking. We can all perceive. We all learn. There's other animals that teach to some extent. They're young and have some, and maybe you could use the word education, but I'd say they teach, but we have an educational system, which is to develop our rational thinking abilities. And that's the thing that has to be done. That's what's got to be judged, not so much the learning styles. But those are some things about how to think about it, why it's wrong, what is right. And then, as I say, if people look at how ancient people had to learn things empirically, how they might have discovered some things. How did they discover music? How did they discover to use an atlatl, or that one worked? How did they discover bows and arrows? And I heard recently that some Indians on the Pacific Northwest of the U.S., centuries ago, developed a fish hook to get, I forgot what kind of fish, like some 300-pound thing from the bottom, halibut maybe. But they were so creative, they developed a hook that would get like the whole mouth of the halibut and close it so the fish couldn't breathe. And that would make it easier to pull up because they'd run out of oxygen. Our people learned that they could like engage in endurance running to run down deer and antelope because they could sweat and keep going, whereas the deer or antelope would tire and get heat exhaustion, and then they could get a meal. They could kill the deer and have a meal. They learned a lot of things like that. People weren't stupid, but it's like a lot of learning from experience. So they can study some things like that to see how we actually learn what's going on and what's involved, what's going on. Anything else, Scott? Okay. So maybe we can have a part 3 of this, discuss this more, and we're a little more awake, and maybe look at a study or two of that's done on learning styles and analyze its scientific method, whether it's valid, and how it does things. Because that's one thing that people should learn in high school, how to generally analyze a scientific study. It's important, and some of this could come up with the learning style stuff, but I know one I actually looked at, is claiming that eating meat is unhealthy. And then you look back and see how they're categorizing things. Okay, what are the concretes from which you're forming your generalization? So I look at this study, they're classifying pizza as a meat. It's got meat on it. It's got freaking bread. It's got tomato sauce. It's got cheese. How the hell can you differentiate the meat, the pepperoni on the damn pizza when it's got this other stuff? Yet they're classifying it as a meat. How the hell can I trust a scientist that can't even do that? That's absurd. That's one skill that's important too. Classifying. How do you classify things? On what basis? You got to look at how they're doing that to really judge the validity of some generalizations. And classifying touches on getting to the essence of something. So, but yeah, maybe sometime in the future we can talk more about that. So, any last words? Just a few yawns and yeah. I'll probably be going to bed pretty soon too. So, all right. So, hope you enjoyed that, folks. It's a nice philosophic and historical perspective of the idea of learning styles. Something that's really needed in the culture instead of just talking about learning styles and not even bother thinking about whether it's true or false or what learning means or the nature of man it presumes nature of human beings. It presumes what a Homo sapien is. We got to stop, dig into that stuff, and really understand it. Unfortunately, and because of the educational system with the fire hose method, people tend to want to go really, really fast. Oh, here's an idea. Let's run with it. But, as I say, and as I've learned on my own, when I'm on forest trails around here, dirt trails, running through the forest, when I sprint, I cannot see very much. If I want to study my surroundings, the only way that's going to happen is if I'm standing still or walking. It's the same thing in studying. Many people get learning styles and run with it. Wrong. You don't see anything. You don't know where you've been or where you're going so much. You're missing information. You're not processing. If you want to know the reality around you, you stop and you don't move for an hour and you process it, or you'll walk really slowly. That's what people need to do with this stuff and more. So we hope, we enjoyed helping you stop and walk, really get to know the surroundings instead of just grabbing an idea and running with it. Sometimes, to have a cheesy little example, I guess, if you're running and not paying attention to where you're going, then you can run off a cliff. But anything else, Scott?
That's it.
Cool. All right. So I hope you enjoyed it, folks. And if you have any questions or comments, just send us a note, and we will talk with you soon. Thanks for listening.